What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing you a card discussion on Effect Veiler. Effect Veiler is one of the very first hand traps we ever had in this game's history, and on top of that, Effect Veiler is actually making a bit of resurgence in the competitive meta, so I thought it was worth discussing today how relevant Effect Veiler is, kind of the pros and cons, and if it's worth running as a whole. But before we get into that, I want to give a huge shout out to my newest patrons, as always. So big shout outs today to Marin, as well as Edgar. You guys are the reason that this channel is growing strong. And if you guys want to help support me in the channel through Patreon, then check out the Patreon link in the description below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So Effect Veiler is a light level 1 spellcaster tuner effect monster with 0 attack and 0 defense, with an effect that reads as follows. During your opponent's main phase, quick effect, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard. Then target one effect monster your opponent controls. That face-up monster your opponent controls has its effects negated until the end of this turn. So, seems pretty good on paper, but one of the interesting things about Effect Veiler is that it actually saw a massive decline in play to pretty much almost extinction because of the fact that SPYRAL Resort was such a popular card. When SPYRAL was the best deck of the format, Effect Veiler was effectively unplayable because SPYRAL Resort protected all the Spiral cards from being targeted, and I feel like this isn't really Effect Veiler's fault. I feel like it's more it was a victim of circumstance of the time it was created, because, I mean, look now, Ash Blossom doesn't target, Ghost Ogre doesn't target, none of the hand traps nowadays target, and back then, targeting was kind of the primary way of designating how a card would interact with another, and so I think that because of this, Effect Veiler actually fell short in a lot of respects, especially now in modern day Yu-Gi-Oh! However, this gave rise to SPYRAL Gamma because it basically replaced Effect Veiler because it doesn't target. We're going to be comparing Effect Veiler to this card a lot in this video because I think it's a natural comparison since both of these cards are seeing a very, I would say about equal rise in play at the moment, and that's very worthy of discussion. So what decks is Effect Veiler strong against? Well, let's take a look at the best decks of the current format. So starting with Pendulum Magician, you can use Effect Veiler to hit heavy metal foes Electromite, and that's pretty good because now you're going to be able to deny your opponent from getting the Astrograph Sorcerer, or I guess any Pendulum monster they want to their extra deck. Not only are you going to be able to do that, you're able to stop them from adding a card from their extra deck to their hand by popping any card, and denying them that free draw that they get as a result of that. So that's pretty damn good, but there's a big drawback here in the fact that Effect Veiler acts as a -1 because it leaves the heavy metal foes Electromite on the field. Now, that may not be a big deal, but it is because Effect Veiler isn't negating heavy metal foes Electromite's Link Arrows, and why that's such a big deal is because the Pendulum Magician player is going to be able to pendulum summon multiple monsters from the extra deck and not just one. This is where a card like Ghost Ogre or SPYRAL Gamma is a lot more effective. Gamma not only negates the effect, but it also moves the heavy metal foes Electromite off the board, which means now they're back to square one and they're not able to get multiple resources out of their extra deck and really get that full value from the Electromite. Effect Veiler is also a little bit weak in the Pendulum Magician matchup because what else are you really going to negate? Well, you might want to negate some of their big powerhouse negate cards like Vortex Dragon or Jackal or Naruto, but the issue is your opponent is more than likely going to be using these cards during your turn, and the big issue with Effect Veiler is that it can only be used during your opponent's main phase, and that's a very big drawback in that respect because it really takes away from the versatility that Effect Veiler has, where again, in comparison to SPYRAL Gamma, Gamma can be used on either player's turn. It's also not restricted to being solely used in the main phase, which means depending on what your opponent chooses to negate with Vortex or with their Naruto, you could actually use Gamma as a way to counter one of these cards and proceed on with your plays. Now this moves us on to True Draco. Now, True Draco is a bit of an odd one because, well, the deck plays about 6 to 7 monsters in the main deck, and basically out of those, the 4 that it plays, Effect Veiler is pretty bad against all of them. I mean, you have Masterpiece, which most of the time Masterpiece is going to be immune to monster effects, which means it's not going to be any helpful in the slightest. Then you've got Ignis Heat as well as Majesty Maiden, and the issue with both of those is that their effects are most likely going to trigger during your turn when you play a card so that they can get a search, which means you can't use Effect Veiler to negate them because it's not during your opponent's main phase. Additionally, you have a Mono Iwado, where you can't negate a Mono Iwado because as soon as a Mono Iwado hits the board, Effect Veiler becomes absolutely worthless, so Effect Veiler is essentially dead in this matchup altogether. Then we move on to TRICKSTARs. Now this is where we're going to have the turning point where Effect Veiler is going to start seeing a little bit more use than normal, because Effect Veiler can be used to stop something like a CANDINA search, and that can be huge, because not only does the TRICKSTAR player relinquish their normal summon to do so, but if you prevent them from getting TRICKSTAR Reincarnation to the hand, that's a really big deal. And I guess you could also use it to stop something like TRICKSTAR Lilybell in order to go off with their combos and potentially OTK you. I think that's really big because Lilybell can be one of those annoying cards that can actually just kill you out of nowhere, and having a card like Effect Veiler can be very useful in that aspect. You can also use it against really anything in the extra deck if you need to, because they are going to be using their extra deck quite a bit with cards like Scapegoat, and anything that you really don't want to deal with you can pretty much hit with Effect Veiler outside of something like Borreload Dragon. Then you also have Eater of Millions, which Eater of Millions is actually a very good hit because this is one of the cards that can deal with any monster that TRICKSTAR has a very difficult time getting over. And if you Effect Veiler the Eater of Millions in the main phase, if they try to go to the battle phase, now the Eater of Millions isn't going to be able to do anything, and you're going to be in a very good position. So I think Effect Veiler actually is a pretty decent option against your TRICKSTAR matchup. Then you've got stuff like Invoked MEKK-KNIGHT, where if you're hitting the ALEISTER, very similar to CANDINA and TRICKSTAR, you're denying them from getting the invocation, and you're also denying them the normal summon, which is a very big deal as well. Now the other thing is, if they have the invocation already in hand, you're pretty much just taking a minus on the Effect Veiler, and you're going to be in a very bad position, because not only do they have the invocation, you just gave them a light target to make a Macabre for basically free, and that's not really going to help you out in the slightest. However, just like with the other cards, you have stuff like you can hit MEKK-KNIGHT Blue Sky, which prevents your opponent from getting a ton of advantage and really dominating the duel from that point. You can also use Effect Veiler on Macabre as well during your opponent's turn. Let's say you have a way to pop the Macabre during their turn. If they use the Macabre's effect to negate your card, you can use Effect Veiler in response and ensure that Macabre is going to hit the graveyard. So that's a really big deal, and that's kind of an advantage that Effect Veiler has, because you can't use a card like PSY-Framegear Gamma in this instance, because if you have a monster, you can't play Gamma on the board to negate the Macabre. So I think that's a really good application for Effect Veiler. Then you also have Lightsworn. There's a ton of good cards in Lightsworn you can hit with Effect Veiler. You can hit Scorpio, you can hit Curious. I can go on and on, but there are just so many powerful monsters in Lightsworn decks that you really just don't want to have anything to do with, and Effect Veiler is going to do a very good job at doing that. Now here's the thing, when it comes to Effect Veiler, I've been talking about how, you know, it's not really good against a lot of the top tier decks until you get to more of maybe like the tier 2-ish type decks. However, where does Effect Veiler shine? Because as we've been discussing, Gamma looks a lot more promising in a lot of different aspects, and I feel that it's definitely worth mentioning the aspects where Effect Veiler is stronger. So Effect Veiler is stronger because you don't have to play a brick like PSY-Frame Driver. A lot of people really hate the Gamma engine because of the fact you have to play a 4th card, which basically does absolutely nothing 99% of the time, and if you draw it, it's going to start taking away from the consistency of your deck as a whole, whereas Effect Veiler, you have no such contingency, and you're free to just play the 3 Effect Veiler, just all well and good. Then you also have the fact that Effect Veiler isn't once per turn. Now, Gamma theoretically isn't once per turn, but the thing is you're only going to be playing one driver, and that means you need to use Gamma on your turn to make a PSY-Frame Lord Omega to get driver into the graveyard. Otherwise, you're not getting another use out of that Gamma, because the driver will banish itself if you use it during your opponent's turn, and I would say 7 or 8 out of 10 times, you're probably using Gamma on your opponent's turn to stop them from doing a play and slowing them down, which means you're going to lose the driver, but ultimately Gamma did its goal. Effect Veiler, on the other hand, is perfectly fine. You don't need to run the driver in the first place, and you can use multiple during your opponent's turn. And even though we've discussed some suboptimal instances for Effect Veiler, having to play through multiple effect veilers is still very difficult for a lot of different decks to manage. The third and final reason I feel Effect Veiler is better than Gamma is the fact that it's a slightly better card going first. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, when you're going second, Effect Veiler and Gamma essentially fill the same role. They effectively are going to be negating the effects of your opponent's monsters. Now, obviously Gamma is better in a lot of instances as we've discussed, but pretty much if you're just looking for sheer negation, they're both good at doing what they do. However, when it comes to going first, it's a much different story. Gamma is only good up until a certain point on your turn 1, because as soon as you play a single monster, Gamma is absolutely dead. Now that's very beneficial because if you're playing a ton of spell cards that allow you to search and draw cards, it's going to protect you from your opponent's hand traps. But the second you play a single monster on the board, Gamma is not going to do anything, and it's pretty much just going to sit in your hand as a dead card. Effect Veiler, on the other hand, while it doesn't grant you that similar protection from hand traps that Gamma does, if you establish your board and maybe you have one negation or even 2 forms of disruption, you have the Effect Veiler still in your hand as a third or second unknown form of disruption unbeknownst to your opponent. So it doesn't become a dead card because even if you have monsters on the field, you're still able to activate the Effect Veiler to negate one of your opponent's monster effects, and it's just another threat that they have to deal with. And having monsters on the board is good because where Gamma has a drawback is not having monsters on the field isn't progressing your game state for most decks, but being able to have monsters on your board and have a card in your hand that can negate the effects of your opponent's monsters is a really big deal. And I feel that personally these are the 3 reasons why players choose to play Effect Veiler over a card like Gamma. While both of these monsters both negate effects, I feel that they're both used in different roles depending on the type of deck that you're playing and depending on what you're trying to achieve in the certain win conditions that that deck wants. But ultimately, I'm going to leave that up to you guys to decide which you prefer, Effect Veiler or PSY-Framegear Gamma. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about Effect Veiler as a whole. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video informative, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.